I get emails and conversations from people saying, well, I feel this, I feel that. What should I do? And I'm like, well, you felt it, right? There's a lot of disconnect for a lot of people with accepting what their body's telling them and feeling that it's important.
Welcome to Metabolic Matters podcast. Let's meet today's guest.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another engaging conversation on the Metabolic Matters podcast. Today, I am really excited to have a very interesting conversation, maybe more. We're already talking behind the scenes of getting him back on for a few more episodes, so stay tuned for that. But today, we're going to talk with Spencer Feldman, who has been, you're going to tell us a little bit more about this, but you've been in the industry of helping people detoxify safely and effectively for well over 20 years. You've come up with some really interesting novel formulations and even novel delivery systems on helping people do just that. You've helped myth bust around the why or necessity of chelation or of detoxification. And you've really helped people understand that living on the planet today, it's probably important to take these matters in your own hand, not just with like a few pills here and there, but kind of a day-to-day diet and lifestyle approach, which is very near and dear to all the things that we do and talk about within this community. So I just kind of want to start by saying, this is a world we live in today that we're just bombarded on every single level. Metals in our air, water, food, chemicals, disrupting our hormones in our food systems, wildfires burning up the whole West Coast, filled with all kinds of toxins. It's really difficult to get away from toxicity. My teacher, Walter Crinnion, considered one of the forefathers of environmental medicine, he used to say, no longer a matter if you have toxins, it's how bad is it? And how is your body handling it? And what is needed to support the body through the process? And I think that you, Spencer, have a really good handle on just how to do that. And we're going to dive into some of these nuggets today. But first off, let's kind of hit the big controversial one. There are a lot of naysayers out there who says that no one needs to detox, that we have built-in systems that should do this on its own without any help, that we were perfectly designed to do this on our own. But as clinicians in the field of integrative medicine for as many decades as I've been and my colleagues, it seems to me that we might need a little extra help from time to time. So what say thee to that? And first of all, welcome and tell us a little bit about how you got into this before you dive into the should I or should I not consider detoxification?
Well, hey, Nasha, thank you for having me on your show. So my origin story is similar to a lot of people in the alternative medicine community, which is I was sick. My illness was actually caused by traditional medicine, my allopathic medicine. And so when I wanted to try to heal myself, I realized I was going to have to go into the functional medicine alternative community. And I fell in love with it. It was such an interesting puzzle for me that I made a career out of it. And now it's 3 generations later. And, I'm still learning and I'm still enjoying the research and the satisfaction of helping people get their health back. To your point specifically, when a practitioner or a doctor says it's unnecessary, we already have detox pathways. Well, so that's half truth. So we do have detox pathways, absolutely. And were this the 1700s, then that would be completely sufficient. But nowadays, with 2 centuries of poor diet and poor soil maintenance, the genetics of the humans now, we're weaker than we were. I mean, our great-grandparents were tough as nails, and each generation gets a little weaker. So the human frame has devolved a little bit, degenerated a bit. The sheer mass of chemicals and metals, millions of chemicals are literally been invented, with more coming on. And so if you want to say, you're only getting a little bit of flame retardant from your clothing and you're only getting a little bit of food dye and you're only getting a little bit of pesticide, you can make that argument about what, and even if we weren't to say synergistically they compound and magnify, which they do, the mass accumulation of lots of these insults, it's an enormous burden. And then you take on the intentional insults, which is people in positions of power offering therapies made out of venoms for situations. There's weight loss, and then there's people looking to replace their immune system with certain injections. So then we have other things that are coming at us. So Yeah. I mean, so take a look at aluminum. Aluminum, if you do metal analyses, you'll see it's probably the most common metal toxin. It's common from a natural standpoint because it's one of the most common elements on the planet in our crust, so it's in food. But it's also used as a flocculating agent to purify municipal water. And depending on your perspective, some people believe that aluminum and barium is in chemtrails. So, it's an extremely rare thing to find someone who has low level of toxins. No one has none anymore. I mean, they're finding forever chemicals, in food, milk of animals, and in penguins, and in the North Pole, so in Antarctica. So the idea that we don't need to support our bodies, I think, is it's ignorance and hubris. The moment you do 3 or 4 chemical and mental analyses on people that you think are healthy, that is pretty quickly discarded. It's basically the doctors, having a knee-jerk reaction to the idea of snake oil salesmen trying to push things that they don't need. And I respect that position, but they also need to educate themselves a little bit more on how people are really getting sick in the modern world and what needs to be done.
Really appreciate that you started really talking about kind of the ubiquitous, aspect of the toxins we're around. And when we can even test, you alluded to animal milk, but we can also test it in cord blood, over 200 chemicals in cord blood. And many of these new chemicals have really shown up in just recent times, within a generation or two, since basically World War II. And so our bodies have not been able to adapt to all of this new information. And so I really appreciate that you're sort of supporting kind of an outdated belief system that our bodies should be able to handle this. But I don't think anybody signed up for as much as what we're exposed to today. So I really appreciate you bringing that to.
I suspect that in 2 or 3 generations, if we don't get this under control, we're going to see a change in the shape of the human body with a wider abdomen, more like an insect, and an enormous liver is how it's going to have to evolve.
Aren't we already there? I mean, fatty liver is how much percentage of the population? I think upwards of 70% of the population today. And our waist to hip ratio, our circumference on the metabolic markers, are saying that 93% of Americans are metabolically dysfunctional, which also includes that hip to waist ratio. So I think we're already seeing that metamorphosis, unfortunately, in real time. But
well, that's the bad news. But let's get to the good news. Let's
exactly.
talk about it.
And that's before we do, can you just very high level explain the 3 pathways, the 3 phases of detoxification, so that when we start to dig into the solution, people have a little more context for that, perhaps?
Sure. So if a toxin is water soluble, you're going to urinate it out. Unless it's really small and then it can pass the blood-brain barrier. Lipid soluble or very small particles can get into the brain. And we'll get how to detox the brain shortly. So if it's water soluble and you're drinking a fair amount, so you're not dehydrated, which is rare for people, then you urinate most of it out, and some of it may get to the bones and the connective tissue and the brain, but mostly you're getting it out. So the trick is, what do you do for things that are fat soluble? Mm-hmm. And what do you do for things that you can't grab onto? These are called forever chemicals, right? There's no way for the body to grab onto it to get it out. So for fat solubles, functionally, what that'll do is a fat soluble or an amphipathic molecule, which is something that can play in both worlds, the water and the fat soluble realm. They'll get through the blood-brain barrier, and they'll also get intracellular. And so the body has to have a way of dealing with this. And what it does is it has to turn it water soluble. So for instance, if you have grease on a dish and you dunk it in water, the grease is still there. But if you dunk it in soapy water, that soap is a chemical that interacts with the grease to make it water soluble, and now it can rinse off. So what we're looking for in detox is a kind of soap, and we need different soaps or different toxins that are fat soluble in order to make them water soluble so that we can urinate them out. Now, the first part of that is phase 1. That's where something called the cytochrome P450 enzymes are going to either unmask or attach a polar molecule to a fat soluble chemical. And what that means is polar means it has an electrical charge. A fat soluble is something with no charge. It's neutral, right? So because water is polar, then polar things can dissolve in water, and because fat is neutral things dissolve in fat. So we're trying to make the fat soluble things, which are neutral, polar, so water can get into them. So it's either going to add a polar group onto it or unmask one that's already there. And this is what coffee enemas do. They stimulate cytochrome P450. However, coffee enemas don't work like they used to 50 years ago, as many protocols don't, because people are sicker and more malnourished. Because there's something called phase 2, and phase 2 is once the molecule is made polar, a conjugate goes onto it. That would be glutathione, but also depending on the chemical, it could be sulfur or peptides, or it could be glycine, or it could be methyl groups. There's all sorts of, there's vitamin B5. There's all sorts of things that can bind to it, depending on the chemical you're trying to bind. That's phase 2. And then phase 3 is it then leaves about 25% through the bile and about 75% out the urine. So we need to make sure all 3 phases are operational. Phase 1, coffee enema, or we have a product called Zenoplex, which is a coffee suppository. I think it's more enjoyable, less experience. But then phase 2, now you see people who have multiple chemical sensitivities. They get into an elevator. So a person goes into an elevator, someone has some cologne on, they get really sick. Here's what happened. Phase 1 was working in them, but phase 2 crashed. They didn't have the conjugates available. And phase 1 will temporarily make the toxin more reactive. Mm-hmm. And then phase 2 comes in and kind of seals it up. So multiple chemical sensitivity people, they are actually making toxins more toxic internally. Okay. So you can't give them just phase 1. You have to give them the phase 2. But then you've got people who have lots of sludge in their gallbladder, or don't even have a gallbladder, but sludge in their liver, fatty liver, and their kidneys aren't moving properly. And so now you've got these water-soluble toxins, phase 1 and phase 2, but they hang around longer. And even a water-soluble toxin is still a toxin. It still does damage. So we need to get all 3 phases operational. So for phase 1/phase 2, we have our Zenoplex product, which is a mix of organic coffee and all the conjugates going as a suppository right up the portal vein, and we have it there where the liver wants it. For phase 2, we have a product called glytamins, and you can also chelate out the kidneys. But this is glytamins is our response to, hey, I want to do a liver gallbladder flush, but I don't want to drink a cup of olive oil and give birth a bunch of stones. I'd rather slowly melt them out over a week or 2. And so we've been very successful with that with people who are very late stage gallbladder issues. And that's phase 3. Now, then you have things called forever chemicals. These are things that you just can't bind to. There's just nothing. For instance, Teflon, which is on nonstick cookware and in a lot of our clothing with anti-stain stuff, is non-stain because nothing will grab onto it. But that also means if you get in your body, nothing can grab onto it. You can't get rid of it. And plastics can be this way. So you have to go at these with a different way. You can't use covalent or ionic bonds. Covalent is where you share electrons, and ionic is where you rip them all going to the other end. All right. You can't use those on these because there's nothing to grab onto them with. What you use are van der Waals forces, which are electrostatic forces. And so there's a way in which you have to start using electrostatic detox, which is a whole other thing you can do. And there's binders that are electrostatic binders. And then we make our electron charger to increase the amount of voltage in the body to give you the electrostatic force to be able to start pushing these things out. So you can get out microplastics and forever chemicals. You just have to understand that it's an entirely different process. Now, I mentioned ionic and covalent bonds. That takes us to metal toxicity, which is kind of another thing that's out. And when you look at the metals, you could classify them roughly into hard and soft metals. And it's not really so much how hard or soft they physically are, although it is a little bit. It has to do with their ionic radius and their charge density and other technical things. And then there's ones that are borderline. But as a general rule, things like gadolinium and aluminum and titanium and iron and barium, those are all hard. And things like silver and lead and mercury, those are soft, and copper for women who do copper IUDs. And so depending on the metal that you have, you need to have the right kind of chelator, because on different chelators, you need a hard chelator for a hard metal and a soft chelator for a soft metal. If you have a hard chelator, like EDTA with the OH group, and you try to grab a soft metal like mercury, it won't be a good grab and you're going to redistribute. And vice versa, if you have a soft chelator like a mercaptan group, SH, and you try to grab a hard metal like aluminum, it's not going to grab well and you're not going to get it. So you have to understand, in terms of chelation, what kind of metals and what kind of chelators. Now, it's a little bit easier.
I want to pleasure because this is so fascinating. And I don't want people to miss the importance of this conversation. But before you dive into that, can you share very briefly, because people are like, so what? I have heavy metals. I would love just to take a moment, because one of the things I heard you say in another interview was how these metals will basically mimic or be imposter to your good nutrients. Can you give a couple examples of where that might happen with tissues of the body, what nutrients we're talking about these metals displacing, and what that means to us in the healthcare system before we dive into the types of chelators?
Okay, we'll get to more chelators in another interview. Issues. So basically what happens is there are nutritional metals. Most of the elements on the periodic table are metals, like 95 of them or something like that, right? So calcium and zinc and chromium and copper, we need these, right? So there are things that are good for us as long as the amount is correct, right? Too much copper from IOD gets you sick. Or there are things that are good for us, but only in the right location. So we need calcium, but not in our arteries, and not in our joints, and not in our breast, and our prostate, and our brain. Okay. So those are the good ones, as long as they're the right amount in the right place. And then the other ones that are actually not good for us. And these are things like titanium and lead and mercury and cadmium. Now, what happens is there are transporters that are in the cells, and they move things in and out of the cells. They bring nutrition in and toxins out. And sometimes they're active and sometimes they're passive. And there's a number of them that are there just for metals. And they're of a particular size and shape so that they can grab onto the size of what they're looking for. Oh, there's some calcium. I could use some calcium. Oh, I could really use a little bit of potassium, right? 100 pills a day. However, toxic metals can be very similar in terms of size, but may have a different electrical charge to them. So when they say, oh, wow, look, there's a little bit of calcium, but it's actually lead, right, and the lead has a different electrical charge, that difference in the charge means it gets in the transporter like a revolving door and then can't get out. So like, imagine you're at it's Christmas and there's a big department store, there's a sale, and then some people get into the revolving doors and then won't leave. Now, nobody can get in the store, nobody can get out, right? It's like putting cement in your toilet. Not going to work. Gluing your refrigerator shut. So the metals get stuck in places. Now, the other thing is metals can be catalysts. The catalytic converter in your vehicle is something that turns the carbon monoxide and some other things into carbon dioxide. So a catalyst, by definition, is an agent that accelerates the speed or ease with which a chemical reaction takes place that might not otherwise happen.
Yeah.
So when we start taking, one of the first uses of catalysts was using hydrogen and nickel to turn sheep oil, cottonseed oil, into Crisco. So now you can have an oil that wouldn't go bad. Hydrogenated fats, right? Well, so when we have metals inside of our bodies, reactions happen that would never happen otherwise, right? And one of those reactions, and just to make it easy, is we turn into Crisco internally. The metals, aside from creating massive amounts of free radical damage, will cause our fats in our bodies to become basically Crisco. Wow. And, you can kind of see that if you look at age spots on the skin. There's kind of an external image of that. But so we want the metals out for a number of reasons. And the catalytic aspect is part of that.
So big, because I think that's the place, like it can replace more forcibly some of the important nutrients to help things function. So I like, there was some way you put it, sort of like we become really difficult to take the good stuff in and get the bad stuff out. I mean, I'm really oversimplifying, but that revolving door image will stay with me for life, I'm sure. So I'm now come back because as a clinician, when I was in medical school, naturopathic medical school back in the 90s, this is when sort of the father of chelation came and actually taught in my medical school. And we were all learning the IV chelation and we were all practicing it left and right on each other and our patients in the medical center. And holy crap, were we seeing problems, and myself included. We'll come back to that conversation soon when we get to the gadolinium. But what we were seeing was people were getting far sicker. And of course, we were being just told that those were detox reactions. And it took another decade, 15 years, for that doctor to come back and say, oops, I screwed up. We've learned more, which is what I love about this man, is because he learned and evolved. But I cannot even tell you how many people are still practicing what he taught 30 years ago and still applying what he learned 30 years ago, despite the fact that he's moved on multiple iterations since then and doesn't even recommend IV chelation anymore and some of these other more aggressive chelates because of what you were starting to talk about. So now to kind of round it out of what we learned and what we've learned over the last 30, 40 years in this space, you were starting to speak to the importance of the right chelator at the right time. So take it away from there, Spencer.
So the first thing is there are chelators that are toxic because they're compromised. Like there are some calcium EDTAs, and you'll find high levels of aluminum in them, even though you find them even though they're being sold by pharmacies. So that exists. The idea of an IV is for proteins that would be destroyed by stomach acid. And many chelators are proteins. So I understand the IV, but you could also do it by suppository, which we made, got a patent on 25 years ago. So that, but also now with liposomal technology, we can do it with liposomals. So now the question is, how does someone get hurt doing chelation? Now, chelation was predominantly EDTA for the last 70 years. And, I'm among that group. But the issue with chelation, there's a couple of ways to hurt somebody with chelation. And what we're trying to do is pull those metals. So the metals get stuck in the transporters and in the tissue. And then we need something that has a greater affinity for the toxic metal than our tissue does. So it'll rip it out. Now, some of the problems are basically come down to redistribution, meaning you pull out a metal from someplace non-toxic, let's say abdominal fat, and then it gets then the chelator lets go and it gets someplace worse, like inside the brain. So the redistribution has to do with stability constants, like how strong it is attaching to the metal, and whether you're using the right chelator for the right metal. As traditionally, you'll see redistribution events with lead, with mercury, and gadolinium. So what we're looking for, and this is what makes for a perfect chelator.
Yeah.
We want something that's ring-shaped and not linear. Most of the chelators out there are linear. DOTA, which we have in our CaptaMed product, is ring-shaped. Ring-shaped chelators they're newer to the field, and they're orders of magnitude more stable, meaning less likely to redistribute. Okay, the second thing you want is you want to have as many functional groups on there as possible, right? So, for instance, there's a very popular mercury chelator out there that has 2 mercaptan groups on it.
Right.
That's not a lot, right? So we have to understand is at the molecular level, bonds are breaking and reforming millions of times a second. So if you have something that has 8 functional groups on it and all 8 are attached, if at any point in time, 1 or 2 of them flash off, there's still 6 holding it. If you have 1, 2, or 3 of them on there, or even 4, then the fewer you have, the more likely you are to hit jackpot and have them all pop off at the same time, and then it's free to go, and that's redistribution. So DOTA, now the other thing is you don't know what metal someone has. You can test. What you're going to find is they typically have both. They have hard and soft, which means you need a chelator that has both hard and soft. So you're looking for a hybrid chelator. So the things that bond to the hard metals are the short-chain fatty acids, which your microbiome makes for you. We've got our Phylomet short-chain fatty acid product for that, if you want to play with that. And then the OH group, right? Those are the 2 main things that are healthy for you that can bond to a hard metal. For the soft metals, what you have is the mercaptan, that's the SH, and then you have the CH3, you have the methyl group, right? Those are the 2 main ones there. So what my want in a chelator is something that's ring-shaped, so that's more stable, with lots of functional groups and, maybe a little bit of each. So no matter what it sees, it can grab onto it. And that's DOTA. And DOTA is a ring-shaped chelator. It's got 8 functional groups, about half and half-ish. And then you've also got the fact that it's got incredibly high stability constant, orders of magnitude higher than anything else out there. Now, the issue with DOTA is it's water soluble. So it can go into and that's our CaptaMed product. It can go into the water compartments of the body. That's the connective tissue, the lymph, and the blood. But 90+% of the toxins are in the fat soluble inside the cells, intracellularly, or pass through the blood-brain barrier. So now we need something that gets into the brain and past the blood-brain barrier, right? So to get inside of the intracellular, you want something that's fat soluble or amphipathic, meaning it can play in both realms. So then you have this molecule called the DMSA, which I'm sure you've heard of and can actually get a lot of people hurt. And it has 2 mercaptans, 2 SH. There's the picture of it right there on the upper left, 2 mercaptan groups, and then 2 OH groups. So it's a hybrid. It does a little bit of hard and a little bit of soft, but it's linear, right? It's not a ring. And it's and not necessarily as soluble as you'd like. So now you can see if you take off one of the OH groups and you add on 2 methyl groups, now we have 2 mercaptans, 2 methyls, and 1 OH. So it's got 4 soft metal bonding groups, and it's epipathic. It will get into the brain and it'll get into the intracellular tissues. So we can use that to clean out the brain and the intracellular spaces of the soft metals. But no soft metal chelator makes a really good bond. It's just the nature of covalent bonds are just not very strong. So the way in which we handle it is we'll say, okay, when I want to detox somebody, first I'll have them on DOTA for a month or 2 until they can get to like 300 milligrams, slowly work their way up and not feel any reaction.
Okay.
Then I'm going to add in a 1-to-1 ratio DOTA and MIADMSA. And I'll tell you why. I took MIADMSA once on my own when I first got it. I manufacture chelators. You would think I am toxin free. I've taken all the fancy mercury chelators out there. Nothing. I could take, a quarter to half a teaspoon of amaramide, nothing. I took one of these things and the whole room was spinning.
Wow.
It was definitely mobilizing a lot of stuff. And then I said, okay, this isn't good. What's going on? Well, it must have redistributed. So then I took the DLTA, and within about a minute, the reaction stopped and I was okay. So the protocol now is 1-to-1 ratio. Once you've cleared your water, partly got a 1-to-1 ratio of MIADMSA, which is our Dasamet product, and DOTA, which is our Capamet product, so that it's going. The idea is to get the MIADMSA intracellularly, pass the blood-brain barrier, pull out the soft metals, the mercury, the lead, the copper, knowing that it's not going to be the greatest bonds. That's just the nature of soft metal bonding. It's not going to, covalents are not strong. And then once it gets into the blood and it says, wow, I could really use a hand, the DOTA comes and says, okay, I've got it from here. It's a relay race. It takes it, and then out it goes.
Amazing.
That doesn't solve the issue for what to do with things like hard metals that get in the brain, like aluminum and barium, because we need a hard metal chelator to get into the brain. And for that, I'm looking at orthosilicic acid that's stabilized with choline. But again, it's because it has 4 functional groups, 4 OH groups, and it will pass the blood-brain barrier. However, you definitely want to do that with something like Capamet, because you want something that if it lets go, once it got it out of the brain, it could be like, okay, I've taken it this far, you go the rest of the way. And what a lot of the practitioners are realizing is that stacking chelators is the way to do this. And so in order to stack properly, you have to understand the stability constants of what you're working with, what kind of metals you're working with, and the different compartments of the body that you're trying to access.
Spencer, this is so huge because I think that's what happened for most of us who were trained in chelation therapy, was like just a one-stop shop. You just do this one thing, you just hammer it over and over and over, and then retest in a few months, and then hammer it over and over and retest in a few months. And it becomes quite the cycle, and a lot of damaged kidneys and a lot of damaged brains at the end of the day from my experience. So I really shied away from it. And so when I started hearing about you and your approach, it piqued my interest because I recognize that most of our patients, actually all of us, probably need this to some degree. And so with dietary and lifestyle, we've been able to kind of do the low and slow sort of. I always told the patients the tortoise will win this race over the hare. But you give us some additional tools to help that. And it's a phased process. One of the things we talked about before we came on this live call was about testing, because I'm really a big fan of testing, and not necessarily heavy metal testing and whatnot, because I sort of just assume that everyone has all kinds of combination of soft and hard metals and various environmental toxins and both fat and water soluble, toxins and endocrine disruptors. I just make those assumptions of living on planet Earth today. So usually have people save their pennies for other things. But you even said that, testing is very limited and more just approaching it through a kind of a dietary lifestyle, supportive, phased detox that you just beautifully articulated to us is more the way to go. Is there anything you'd add to that or clarify about anything to share?
One last thought on the detox. You've probably heard of doing things like dosing in the half-life.
Yeah.
I don't do that, right? Because one, half-lives are completely different from person to person, depending on kidney function by factors of 4. And the second is the dosing in the half-life was based on using things like alpha-lipoic acid, which is a terrible chelator, but the best a Cutler had at the time, right? And so he said, okay, well, this will get to the blood-brain barrier, but it's going to redistribute. So when you have something that doesn't redistribute, when you solve the redistribution problem, half-life is not as much of an issue. So, okay, but now let's talk about testing. When clients come to see us, there are $10,000, $20,000, $50,000, $100,000, sometimes dollars into their recovery, so we have to mind their finances. So yes, the more testing, the better, if you can do it, and if not too invasive, understanding that there's false negatives, right? And not every test is going to show things like, you could have a test that shows high uranium, but the test lab wasn't able to distinguish uranium from gadolinium.
True. Right.
So in terms of testing, what I would almost rather do, so, the FDA requires statements that says this is not for diagnosis therapy, because if you have a good product, you can use it diagnostically. If you give somebody a product and they get better or temporarily worse, but on a better curve, that is diagnostic, right?
Right.
You can use good protocols diagnostically if you understand what kind of thing to expect from them.
Yes, great.
So, there's a lot of testing, like for instance, we test for kidney function with chelators, but kidney testing only tests the glomerulus. It doesn't test the peritubular function, which is 80% of your kidneys. So, we can say, oh, their kidneys are fine because they've got a good BUN creatinine ratio, but their peritubular capillary system is completely destroyed. So we have to be mindful that the tests that we do can give us false negatives. And we have to be mindful about the economics of our customers. Sometimes, someone says, well, should I test? I had an MRI with contrast. Should I test for it? I'm like, well, the amount of money you're going to spend on the test, just spend it on the protocol. If you feel better, that's a pretty good sign,
Yeah. And I love that this kind of, you brought up gadolinium a few times, and, just a little TMI of my own story. I told you this on a previous conversation. About 33 years ago, I ended up with severe gadolinium poisoning from multiple MRIs, and to the point of having about 70% function and 30 to 40% function of my kidneys. And so I have tried for 30 years to chelate the gadolinium. And each time I do, I literally go into a stage 3 or 4 kidney failure every single time. And so I am going to be a living experiment with Spencer's products to try this in a very different way than I've ever approached it. Because of what you were describing, I also know I lived in Durango, Colorado, the highest levels of arsenic in the country, the highest levels of mercury from all the coal burning around us. Every single patient I tested for when I had a private practice was off the charts with those things. We had a major international news that our river looked like mustard several years ago when one of the big mines up the road burst and flooded our waters, which is, of course, absorbed into everything in the environment, not just the water itself, but the soil. So like all those things, I just know I'm a walking soup of these things. So I know I have to take it very, very, very carefully. And so what you've described, you give a very reasonable approach of using this even diagnostically. Let your body give you the feedback. Am I pushing too hard? Am I jumping to the next phase too quickly? I think that's one of the cool things I've learned from a few conversations with you and watching you on other interviews, is that there is this beautiful dance of allowing someone to really get to know their own body and their own experience with this. And so maybe speak a little bit, because of the population I serve, there is a risk of a lot of gadolinium and other radiation toxicities because of the very treatment of cancer or screening for cancer. Can you speak to maybe a strategy that you have used safely and effectively in this population with some of the tools that you offer?
So specifically gadolinium?
Sure, let's start there.
Right. So Captamed is 100 milligrams of DOTA. I would start with a half of that, 50 milligrams. You have to be very patient and very gentle with people with gadolinium because you can hurt them. And so just take your time, 6 months, fine. There's no rush. Slowly work the stuff out. And when you can eventually get to the point of 300 milligrams at a time without having a crisis, without feeling bad, lower back pain and such, and brain fog or whatever symptoms, then you can very slowly start one-to-one doing the MIADMSA, which is the DASA, and then the DOTA. So like you do maybe like half a capsule of each of those. Like, how are you? How are you feeling? I get emails and conversations from people saying, well, I feel this, I feel that. What should I do? And I'm like, well, you felt it, right? People are more, there's a lot of disconnect for a lot of people with accepting what their body's telling them and feeling that it's important. So On that line, let's talk about detox crises and trusting your body.
Be good. Yeah.
When you take a detox product that's properly done, you might not feel great, right? Because when you mobilize toxins and they're on their way out, they're still causing damage.
Right.
However, the next day you take it, it should be a little less and a little less and a little less, right? So when I work with people with multiple chemical sensitivities and they try a Xenoplex and they say, oh my God, I'm never doing that again. I said, okay, do a half tomorrow. And then they do a half and they're like, well, it wasn't as bad. I'm like, okay, do a half again. I'm like, okay, it's still bad, but not so. And then, okay, now we do one. And then, you have to let them know. It's like, it's not going to necessarily be a good experience for you if you're really toxic. But here's how you tell. Each day gets easier, right? So if you're doing a product, a detox product, and each day it's either not getting easier or it's getting worse, that's a toxic reaction. Now, that can be from one of two reasons. It can be a product that is toxic in of itself, like a zeolite that wasn't properly washed, right? Or a chlorella that was grown in radioactive water, okay? Or it can be a detox that wasn't properly designed. So they're like maybe stimulating phase 1, but not phase 2, or they're doing a chelator that's redistributing. So trust your body. If you're doing something and your body's like, no, I don't want that, just don't do it. Then trust that. There's something going on, regardless of what doctor tells you what, regardless of what test tells you what. If your body says, don't do that, don't do that, And then maybe with someone like Dr. Nasha and say, hey, my body's saying, don't do this. Can you help me figure out what might be happening? Oh, wow. It looks like you've actually got some hidden stealth infection going on over here. And then you can play that out with somebody.
Before I let you go, I've got 2 more questions, and we're going to have you back because there are so many things, so many rabbit holes go down here. But the way I actually learned about Spencer, everybody, was from something that is going to be perceived as controversial that we're going to talk about right now. But I will tell you, as someone who lives pretty much like a hermit most of the time, but then has to get out into the world and travel in the world and speak around the world, every time I do in the last couple of years, I get very, very sick. And what I've been able to do living in Mexico is to get labs done here very inexpensively that I could not get in the US or could not get affordably in the US, which are labs to check for IgG, IgM, to spike protein and mRNA. And I'm someone who, I will be very forthright, I did not vaccinate. I have had COVID knowingly twice, and which was monitoring my antibodies, even my there's another antibody you can test for down in Mexico, which shows basically is your body still able to recognize and fight this condition. And so I was doing that monthly for many, many months on end. And what I started noticing is each time I traveled, my IgM would spike like crazy. And my spike protein would spike like crazy, despite the fact that I wasn't sick or had a vaccination. So as controversial as this may seem, I was following data. My husband was following data. The hundreds of doctors that I've trained and their patients were following the data. And we were all seeing similar trends. We were starting to get a little panicked because our usual go-tos of fibrinolytics and whatnot weren't working, the typical treatments that we used. And so from that, one of my colleagues and business partner, Cindy Kennedy, did some online research and ran across this company, RemedyLink. And I tried out some of his, what he would call his spike protein detox products, which I'll have Spencer talk to. I have used it. It's actually how I learned about how quickly I was detoxing, because of one of the products, the chelator in that product was something that I had to take a lot slower, the albendextrin, because of my kidney function. But he gave me some strategies just a few weeks ago, and I've been applying those, and it's working beautifully. But that being said, let's talk about this, because this is a conversation that historically we couldn't even have a conversation about. But it's one that I feel though it's controversial, it's critical to have this conversation. So can you talk to us a little bit about what you've learned about spikopathy and about some protocols that you brought to the table that seem to be very helpful in helping folks, whether they've had a natural infection, whether they've had an injection reaction or a booster reaction, or dare I say, as controversial as it sounds, a shedding reaction, which is what I have been experiencing, to be able to deal with this ubiquitous exposure that we are all met with today. Tell us a little bit about how you came upon this process and this product.
Well, I followed with great interest what was going on with the spike protein pathology and the work of artists and nicotine. And and then there's the IgG4, which we can talk about in a second. there's probably a lot more we don't know because there was a lot of malware that was loaded onto this this injection, if you want to call it that. So, some of the things that I look at is, number one, we have a coagulation cascade, right? And all the stuff that gets pulled out on autopsy, right? So we can use proteolytics. We have a product called Protolase, which has the proteolytics that from the research, looks like is maybe most supportive in dealing with that kind of coagulation issue. And so,
which by ubiquitous among our patients, we're checking fibrinogen activity, we're checking D-dimers, we're checking cysteine, CRP. So just so you guys know, we're following data, not dogma, on this and seeing it across the board. Go ahead, Spencer.
Right. So when you see the D-dimer go up, there's your smoking gun. And so we want to break that down with proteolytics. But the problem is when you break down spike protein with proteolytics, it turns into prions. Yeah. So I think there's seven different prions that pop out of it. So we have to be mindful that we're not substituting one issue, which is cardiovascular disorders and coagulation, for another, which is neurologic issues 10 years later, and then they end up with Alzheimer's and such. So we have a product called albodextrin, which is an alpha and beta cyclodextrin, which is basically little tiny sugar buckets that are water soluble on the outside and fat soluble on the inside, and spike proteins. What they do is they when they break into prions, what a prion is a misfolded protein. When proteins are made and they're folded multiple times, the fat soluble parts on the inside, the water soluble parts on the outside, and they can move around. If they misfold, then a little fat soluble part will stick out. And that now it's amphipathic, meaning it can also it's hard to get rid of because it sticks and stays in the fatty tissue and the cell membranes. So if you've got now a spike protein, if you've got a prion as a result of breaking down spike proteins with this little fat soluble thing coming over here, and then what you do is you get this little bucket that's fat soluble on the inside and water soluble on the other. It covers it, rendering the prion water soluble again, and you can pee it out. And so cyclodextrins do that. I use alpha and beta because we want two different sizes depending on what we're trying to kind of grab onto. Cyclodextrins also, I found spectacular results with fatty liver. I thought I was pretty clear, but I had taken Accutane as a kid and my liver got wrecked from it. And when I took cyclodextrins, I definitely felt it. And each day it was less and less. That's how I knew it was not toxic, right? So the albodextrin is what we you did, and that's so the spike protein protocol. You could consider our Protolase as a proteolytic, and you consider albodextrin to support mopping up the prions that it's going to create in that process. Now, the other aspect is the another aspect is what's going on with the immune system, right? And so there is an immunoglobulin called IgG4, which used to be relatively rare. We didn't see it in fact, right? IgG4 disease was very rare. So when we started seeing IgG4 diseases, we're all like, oh my God, what's this? Let me study it. I have no idea what this thing is. And IgG4 is something that calms your immune system down. So for a percentage of the population, their immune system will say, hey, I need to not completely freak out about this reaction caused by the spike protein, or I'm going to go into an inflammatory self-destruct mode. So let me pump up the IgG4. But as a side effect, it brings the entire immune system down. And then you end up with these things where you walk outside the house and you have no immune system. It's basically immune suppression. It's like an immune suppressant drug internally, right? Yes. So now basically it's giving people kind of like low-grade AIDS, and then they walk out, they shake someone's hand, and they get a cold.
Right. And we're seeing a wave of shingles. We're seeing a wave of what people are terming cancers. All these major, weird, immunocompromised, what we used to call opportunistic infection processes, which really were the types of infections that only showed up in people who were severely compromised, such as AIDS or cancer. So things we haven't seen in all of our career showing up overnight made us as clinicians pay attention and look for different solutions. So that's where you are a gift to us. So keep going.
So yes, a lot of us clinicians are having to help clients who are basically demonstrating low-grade AIDS. So what do we do for these poor people? Well, we need to modulate their immune system. And so what is it that modulates the immune system? So it's ultraviolet light. And we can get more into how that happens. But there's a fraction of ultraviolet light in the UVA spectrum that helps the immune system organize itself. So when an immune system makes a memory, it's a distributed memory, like a blockchain. It's very hard for it to forget. So for instance, as an example, let's say you are outside and you're maybe you get the office where you work gets a new cell tower and you're getting lots of nitric oxide in your body. You're in a highly inflammatory state until your body starts to calm down. And that day you go out and you sweep away some, maybe you empty a vacuum cleaner or you sweep up some leaves and you get exposed to some mold. Now the body goes, okay, I'm going to say mold and electromagnetic energy, and I'm going to kind of combine them with this inflammatory response. And I'm going to remember that I feel inflamed when I'm around mold. Mold must be part of the problem, so I'm going to react to mold. But now they get a mold allergy, right? Then someone gets a mercury filling at the same time. Maybe they eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and now they got a peanut allergy because the immune reaction to the mercury is a sensitizing agent, or as a sensitizer, it makes you react to things. It happens at the same time as you have some peanuts with a little aflatoxin on it, and now you're a peanut allergy. Right. So the immune system can make correlations that make sense to hit, but don't serve us long term. And then how do you clear that? So we have a protocol coming out called the UV reset.
Very
Basically,
cool.
it's a vacuum, like a cup, like cupping, like Chinese cupping or Asian cupping, along with this very particular fraction of ultraviolet light. And you place it over the lymph nodes. And what we're doing is we're coaxing the lymph nodes mechanically to release the immunoglobulins and the B cells, as well as stealth infections that can be in there. And then when they come out, we hit them with that particular ultraviolet light, as you're familiar with UV ultraviolet therapy. And then what we're trying to do is we're trying to get the immune system to reassess its position on what it thinks is a good relationship to have with these things. So in terms of things that it is overreacting to, we're trying to ask it to calm down. And in terms of stealth infection that it is underreactive to, we're asking it to pay more attention.
Wow, it's like a couples therapist for the immune system. Wow, that's fascinating. And of course, some of the strategies in the treatment of was them using UV light in buildings and school, houses when we were met with this infection. So we do know that it is responsive specifically to that, but so are many infections. So are many conditions such as mold and fungus, other fungi, et cetera. So what you're describing is not esoteric or woo-woo. We've been using these tools. You're just using them in a really interesting, novel way in combination with the proteolytics to deal with that coagulation pathway, with the albendextrin to sort of grab what gets liberated and get it out of the building. And then with the UV to even pull it out of more of the hiding spots because of the confusion or the disparity of the immune system reaction or overreaction or underreaction process that's going on. So it's like a little trifecta you've created.
Right. And one thing I should mention, getting UV from a tanning booth or from like a Spurti light or going outside, if it's the right wavelengths is great. However, the fraction of UV we're looking for won't get through the upper surface of the skin.
Got it.
So one of the reasons we have the vacuum effect is we're pulling the blood up to the capillaries where we can access it. If ultraviolet wiped out your immune system, then a person would go outside, get a suntan, and then suddenly they get chickenpox again because they lost their immune chickenpox. So we're hacking the way the body works. You can do that with UVVI, and UVVI is great. It's been used for 100 years, and you can take the blood out and hit it with ultraviolet. What we try to create is a way to do that without going to
UVBI without the
or doctors that don't want to do that in their practice. There's not that many practitioners that do UVBI.
Right.
And then by doing it specifically over the lymph nodes, we're really going after the places where, the spleen and the thymus and the armpits and the inner groin and the cervical areas. We're really going after the places where the immune system is basically hanging out and functioning. So that you have to be careful when you do that. First time you do that on somebody, 30 seconds, because if they've got some stealth infections in their lymph and you start mobilizing that and shaking it up, but each time you can do a little more and a little more. And then eventually you get to the point where like, yeah, I did it for 15 minutes. I didn't notice anything. Like, great.
So first of all, I want everyone to have a listen to what we just described here. What Spencer has created is something that I think is going to be helpful for many of us who are facing these conditions in our practices, for many of us who might be dealing with long COVID, for many of us who jump in giant germ capsules and travel often. I'm trying to look at ways to support my own body so I don't get knocked down every single time I travel to do what I came here to do in this world, which is to educate and empower others to take care of themselves and create health resilience. So those are really important pieces that you're bringing to the table. And I definitely want to have you back on so we can talk more specifically to cancer and more specifically to immunology in general. But before I let you go, Spencer, you live a very interesting life. I did a little cyber stalking of you, and you basically live off the grid on 100 acres, living as close to the land and the rhythm of nature as possible. Walk us through a day in the life of your own routine, of what you do to create health resilience and to create rhythm and regulation in your own body and to just naturally detoxify. Let us know what's a typical day for you.
Okay. So wake up at dawn. When you wake up, you should be waking up from dopamine, which is how a child wakes up, meaning I am so excited for the day, right?
Yeah.
But if you don't get a good night's sleep, you don't have dopamine. And so instead you wake up with cortisol and you wake up grumpy and not feeling. So we'll get to sleep at the end of the day. So you wake up in a good mood, and not for TMI, but if you're a male, you should wake up with an additional experience, which tells you your testosterone is moving, which also you got a good night's sleep. And don't let someone tell you, oh, you're 50 or 60, that shouldn't happen. No, if you're female, you should be waking up in a particular way. Okay, so now you wake up, and I take up bicarbonate capsule, a product I make, which is bicarbonates. First thing, and what that does is when bicarbonates get to the spleen via the small intestine, that regulates the immune response in the peripheral tissues. I wait a half an hour, and then I have a fermented drink that I have, which is a product called Ventrivium, which is basically Saccharomyces boulardii and plantaris. And I let that ferment. So I make like a special wine. So I make it at night, and in the morning it's busy. It's like a little cider. And I mix that with 2 tablespoons of organic psyllium. It has to be organic because there's a loophole with the FDA. Non-organic psyllium has sky-high levels of pesticides. And I take that. Now, the first thing when you do when you wake up, within about a half an hour, you should defecate, right? That's not the healthy animal. And you should not need toilet paper. And it should have virtually no smell, right? And it should only take about 10 seconds. You sit down, you go to the bathroom, you stand up. That's what a healthy animal does. No healthy animal soils itself. So then, about a half an hour later, I'll have breakfast. Half an hour after each meal, you should also defecate, right? This is what a healthy animal does. It's 4 defecations a day, first in the morning and 1 after each meal, okay? In order to do that, you actually have to be eating the right amount of fiber, hence the psyllium, okay, which is also a binder, which we can get into. And then what I'll typically do is I will spend, 4 hours doing research and doing consults and pondering things. Then there's some other protocols that I do. You have to exercise, either a treadmill or a stand-up desk. You're gonna want to work out. There are fun things you can do like ionized oxygen and red and infrared light and PEMF and EECP. And so, depending on the day, I'll rotate through various protocols that, are improving my health. Around lunchtime, eating. So, we could talk about eating. The human gut is halfway between a wolf and a pig. So we're halfway between carnivore and omnivore. So you could talk about what that kind of implies for the human diet. And then, and whatever supplements we're going to take, you want to try to get a little outside sunlight on you. And then as the evening is, I'll play a few games of online chess to make sure my IQ isn't dropping, because that's a test, right? If I see my IQ come down, I know that I've got some brain inflammation. So that's I do like Scrabble. Play Scrabble. Play something online every day where you can monitor your mental function, because it's the unreliable narrative. As my mental function declines from a reaction to something, my ability to recognize my mental functioning is declining, and then I get used to it, right? So, you want to know what your peak mental capacity is, and you want to hold yourself there. Okay. And then in terms of, obviously, you want to have a partner in your life, which you can have oxytocin and compassion and love with. And there's a degree of charity to the world, something where you step outside of your own personal needs and work on compassion, and remember that this is all just a test of your ability to be a good soul, right? Do a little self-work, maybe meditate, light a fire. In the wintertime, I cook with wood fire, wood stove. I might hike up in the woods a little bit. And when you're on 100 acres, there's always something that breaks every day. I don't do any water line breaks or something, or wild animals. And in the evening, then we're talking about sleep again. And so you have to be able to sleep through the night And you don't need an expensive sleep test to do this. You simply need to ask yourself, how are my dreams? Okay. You should remember your dreams and they should be neutral or pleasant. If you have a dream where the dream is stressful, maybe you're trying to do something and you can't do it. You can't open the jar. You can't climb the mountain. It's just, why can't I do this thing? And I'm trying to do it over and over and over again. That's hypopnea. That's your inability to breathe because your airway's closing down. Not apnea, or maybe a little bit of apnea. And that's your sign your airways is collapsing, right? If you have a violent dream, that's a dream where you're attacking or being attacked. Or it might be more obvious. You're being smothered or held underwater or holding your breath. That's apnea. That's you stop breathing. And if you get either of those, then you're heading into hibernation. So there go all your sex hormones. And the body is putting you for hibernation, and you're at risk of apoptosis of heart tissue and brain tissue. So there's heart attack and stroke. I think one of the main causes of heart disease, in addition to stress, is sleep apnea, right? 35, it's a third of children snore. Basically, the way the medical establishment says is you can stop breathing 5 times an hour and that's normal and you don't have apnea. No, you don't stop breathing at all. If you do a test, you'll see multiple times during the night, you probably stop breathing. Your oxygen level crashes and your heart rate spikes. That's all. And if you're waking up in a cold sweat with your heart pounding, that's your body's sympathetic response to not breathing for a minute. So fixing your sleep is enormous. We could do a whole talk on that. So assume you got it all dialed. So I'll turn on my electron charger, which is another device I have. I'll set it to 300, which is about what I'd get if I were walking by a waterfall or something. And I'll sleep on that. And it'll charge me all night, keep me charged all night. And if I've done everything right, I have very relaxed dreams. It might be very peaceful, very beautiful. I might be walking through the forest or meeting friends and seeing beautiful colors and having a very nice experience. And then I wake up full of dopamine, excited for the day. And that's how I do it.
I love it. There's such a story here of rhythm and connection to self, partner, the world around you. So many people, the average American, spend less than 15 minutes outdoors every day. Most people, even when I go to big regenerative agriculture conferences, they don't even know what the moon cycle or the sunrise or sunset cycle is. Most farming today is done from a computer versus from the field. And so it's just really interesting that we've gotten so far away from our natural nature.
Speak about that. There's one other thing I forgot to mention you brought up real quick. So in the morning, I only have red lights on. I'm simulating, the sun coming up through the atmosphere at an angle. So everything's red and infrared. Then as my body says, okay, I'm ready to start, all the lighting in my place turns green. I have green, red lights everywhere. And I also have a machine I'm going to make that will do this for you. But so then I go to green. And the reason I do green, aside from the fact that it's the color associated with endorphins and good mood and pain relief and longevity, or makes animals a little longer, is if you are walking under the forest canopy, as an early human, all your light would be green and infrared. So I'm recreating the green effect. Even my screen is green, right?
Wow, I love it.
And then in the middle of the day, I'll do blue for like 5-10 minutes. That's your dopamine and breaking down your bilirubin and your cytochrome P450. The reason it's called cytochrome P450, 450 is the nanometer of a color that activates cytochrome P450. We need blue light. We just get too much and the wrong kinds. And then I go back to green, and then I go back to red, and then now I'm simulating with red and infrared. I'm simulating being in front of the fire with my tribe, cooking meat, hanging out with my kids, playing, telling stories of the hunt. So there's also a color rhythm that happens as well.
Love it. A color rhythm, a sound rhythm, a frequency rhythm of all of the things. This is what we are from, what we are of, what our cells respond to, even down to the pathways, the cytochrome pathways of how our body detoxifies, which was the very topic of our conversation today, but even more fundamentally down into our mitochondrial function, which you just alluded to. And we will come back and dive in deeper into sleep, into immune function, and into cancer, because all of these patterns that we just talked about come down to the function of our mitochondria, which are just these beautiful little, photovoltaic sensing agents. And so you just described your lifestyle as one of the best ways to charge up your mitochondria, which is our fountain of youth. And
it was our first microbiome. It was our first bacteria that we brought in. Everyone thinks the microbiome is just your gut. Every cell has a little microbiome.
Exactly. I love it. So fascinating. So we can even have a whole conversation on that. But Spencer, this has been beyond fascinating, beyond fun. I know that people's brains are just going boop, 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 boop. And so whatever interested you, I want for the community to also let us know what their next wish list is of speaking to you. We have a 9th-long list started. Spencer, how do they find out about you, about your offerings, about RemedyLink, and the way to get their hands on some of these products and start to explore how these feel in their own body?
Sure. So we have a website called RemedyLink.com, RemedyLink.com. And I would think that the best thing would be if you go to the video page there, think, 10 hours maybe of videos of just, as I've been going through this 25-year process of trying to understand the human body and what health means and how you get it, I would make videos. And so watch those. And if something in there is of interest to you, there are protocols there, and you can always reach out and call us or reach me by email as well.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. You are an absolute walking encyclopedia of fascinating information. And Spencer, thank you for bringing so many health tools to our disposal. So very, very grateful for you and all the work you do, and can't wait to have another conversation.
No, it was a pleasure, Nasha. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.